The first thing I saw was her hands rope-burned and bound tight behind her back, the skin raw and purple in the noon sun. The pole she was tied to leaned just enough to creak in the hot wind, its splinters pressed against her shoulder. The crowd didn't speak much, just shifted their boots in the dust, watching her as if the heat and shame might do what a rope could not. I'd meant only to buy flour and nails, but my steps slowed when I reached the edge of the square. The rest of the world seemed to fade behind the throb of my own pulse. Her face was swollen at one eye, her lips split, her bare feet cut and crusted with dry blood. She didn't flinch when I looked at her. She didn't look away either. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever seen a moment where one choice could change everything. I wasn't born in Raven Hollow, but the land out here had been home near enough all my life. My folks raised me on the small spread 30 miles east, close to where the grass thinned into hardpan and mesquite. We worked cattle in spring-cut hay in summer and took what the earth gave in between. Sundays meant church, if the weather allowed dinner, with whoever might ride up and a quiet evening under lamplight. We didn't have much in the way of coin, but we had decency, and that went farther in those days. After the war, what family I had left drifted or died, and I came west of the Dry Fork to a patch of land I could call my own. Built a cabin with my hands fenced enough ground to run a few dozen head and kept to myself. The town grew a little in those years, a railroad spur, a few brick buildings where clapboard had been talk of land sales and new investors. Along with it came folks who measured worth in dollars alone, quick to forget the sweat that had cleared this country. I learned to keep my head down when tempers ran hot. I'd seen what came when a crowd decided its own rules. Men could turn on a neighbor in less than a day, and women fared worse. That morning the air had a stillness to it, the kind that warns of trouble. When I rode in, folks were turned toward the square like churchgoers waiting for a sermon. Only there was no preacher, just that rough pole and the woman lashed to it. Her name I didn't know then, though later it would matter more than most. I heard pieces she'd been with a white man, and he'd left her. That was enough for the town to decide she'd broken some unwritten law. The man was gone, but they still needed their punishment seen. I stood there longer than I meant to, the heat pressing down my jaw set. Whatever was about to happen, I knew I'd have to decide quick whether to walk away or step forward. The deputy stepped forward before I reached her, his boots scuffing in the dirt as he squared himself in my path. Eli Keller had the lean build of a man who thought height alone was authority. A badge pinned neat to his vest and a voice that tried for steady but wavered in the heat. "Afternoon, Braddock," he said, setting himself like a fence post between me and the pole. "Town's handling its own business. No need for you to get in it." I looked past him at the woman. She hadn't moved since I'd first seen her, the rope cutting deep into her wrists, head bent just enough to keep the sun out of her swollen eye. My voice was even. "This what you're calling justice now?" Keller's shoulders rolled in a small shrug. "She broke a rule." His gaze didn't shift toward her. "She's Apache. Took up with a white man, didn't hide it. That's filth, plain enough." I asked where the man was. Keller said he'd gone slipped out 3 days ago without paying for his drinks. "And she gets tied to a pole for it?" I asked. "She stayed," he said, like that was all the answer needed. The rope was knotted high at her back, thick and coarse. I took my knife from my belt, not quick, not threatening, and stepped closer. Keller's voice tightened. "You cut her loose. You answer to the town." The murmurs behind him swelled, boots shifting in the dust, the heat pressing against every breath. I slid the blade under the rope, saw the strands fray and part. When the last one snapped, her arms fell slack, her knees dipping until I caught her by the elbow. She didn't pull away. A voice from the edge of the crowd called out, "You want her, Braddock? She's yours. Not our problem now." I didn't answer, just turned us both toward the open street. Her steps were unsteady, each one a jolt against bare, torn feet. We walked past the saloon, the smithy, and the staring faces until the buildings fell behind us. My land lay 2 miles west, the road a pale ribbon under the sun. The barn sagged to one side, and the grass was long gone from the yard. I led her to the old cattle shed, opened the warped door, and stood aside. The inside was bare, but shaded a dirt floor with walls that still held against the wind. "You can stay here," I said. She stepped in, lowered herself to the floor, and didn't look up again. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, I'd carried out a folded blanket, a tin cup of water, and a thick crust of bread. I left them by the door without a word. Inside my cabin, the fire burned low, while I sat with one boot off, rubbing the old scar on my thigh. The memory of her standing in that square dust and her hair blood drying on her skin clung closer than the day's heat. Morning came pale and cool. I stood in my doorway, coffee in hand, and looked toward the shed. She hadn't come out, but the bread was gone, the cup empty. I carried a basin of clean water, a rag, a slice of salted pork, and left them by the wall. She sat in the corner, her knees drawn up the blanket over her shoulders. Her eyes followed me without a word. Near midday, she stepped outside the blanket still around her, moving slow toward the rain barrel. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and near the hip, the fabric slipping low at the neckline. But she seemed not to notice. She stopped a few feet away. "Why?" she asked. I set down the hammer I'd been using on the fence rail. "Why what? Why'd you cut me down?" Her voice was quiet, not unsure. "You were going to die," I said. She held my gaze. "I didn't do anything wrong." I nodded once. "They never care." She drank from the barrel, small sips, eyes on the horizon. That evening, I set a plate of beans and pork near the fire pit and offered her a stool. She took it, eating without haste, then stood as I asked, "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Nayini." I told her mine. She only said, "I know," before walking back to the shed. The days settled into a rhythm. She rose early, kept to the edges of the land, pulling weeds and clearing brush without asking what needed doing. Her hands were quick, her back straight, and she never paused before a job was done. I left food and water where she could take it. She returned the tools cleaned and set in order. On the 4th morning, she sat sewing an old shirt of mine on the porch step. Her stitches were neat and sure. "Why don't you go into town anymore?" she asked. I kept my eyes on the post I was mending. "Don't like the company?" She nodded. "They don't like you either." "That part's mutual," I said. She didn't press, just bent back over her work. That evening, she joined me on the porch without asking, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. We sat without speaking, the breeze lifting strands of her hair. After a long while, she asked if I knew the man she'd been with. I didn't. She said he'd promised to come back, but she hadn't loved him. She just hadn't wanted to be alone. The next day, I rode into town before sunrise, bought my supplies, and found a plain brown dress in the store's back room. I kept it folded in my saddlebag on the ride home, leaving it at the shed door without mention. She wore it the next day. Her bruises had started to fade her hair cleaner. That night, sitting near the fire, she asked if I'd lost someone in the war. I told her about my brothers. One never returned. One took his own life. The last drank himself to death, and about the woman who'd married another while I was gone. She didn't offer pity, only listened, her shoulder brushing my sleeve before she rose. A week in, we no longer avoided each other's eyes. Sometimes she ate beside me on the porch steps, watching my hands as I worked. Other times she spoke of her own past goats by the Salt River. Her people moved on her choice to run before the rest were taken. I didn't ask more. One morning I found her bent over the garden patch, turning the dry soil. "You think anything will grow?" I asked. "Not this year," she said, straightening, "but I'll turn it anyway." I asked if the man had ever hurt her. She shook her head. "He didn't protect me either." That evening, I brought out my spare revolver, laid it on the table. If trouble comes, you should know how to use it. She picked it up, checked the cylinder, tested the weight. You going to teach me? She asked. You don't need it, I said. She set it down. Then maybe just company. That night, she didn't go straight back to the shed. She stayed longer on the porch, her hand brushing mine before she leaned in to kiss me, soft, steady, without rush. I don't owe you anything, she said. I know, I told her. The next days moved with a quieter ease, though I kept the rifle closer at hand. We spoke little of what had passed in town, but it stayed between us, a shadow we both knew would lengthen again. And sure enough, the first sign came in the distance, a pair of riders easing down the trail from Raven Hollow. Their shapes cut sharp against the late sun. The riders came on slow, the low sun at their backs, kicking up a thin veil of dust that hung in the air behind them. By the time they reached the gate, I could make out Eli Keller's badge catching the light and Martin Thorne's narrow frame in the saddle beside him. Both kept their reins short, their horses shifting in the dry grass as they looked past me toward the cabin. I stepped down from the porch rifle, hanging loose in my hand, but not out of sight. Keller cleared his throat. Morning, Braddock. Got a minute? His tone carried the weight of something already decided. I didn't move any closer. Say it from there. His eyes flicked toward the doorway where Naney stood still as a fence post. Her dress moving slightly in the breeze. Town council says you're harboring someone who doesn't belong here, he said. She belongs here now, I told him, my voice flat. Not your call, Keller replied. On my land it is. He shifted in his saddle jaw tight. This isn't finished. There's talk going around. I kept my eyes steady on his. Let them talk. You ride up on my property again without cause, I'll take it as a threat. Thorne's gaze lingered on Naney a moment. Something in it not quite as sharp as Keller's before he tipped his hat and turned his horse. The two of them rode off without another word. When the dust settled, I turned to her. They'll be back. She didn't look away, I know. Her hands were still, but I caught the faint tremor in her fingers. I reached out and took one in mine. Stay close, I said. Whatever comes. She nodded once. That afternoon, I saddled the mule, and we rode south toward the cottonwoods, where the air held a trace of cool. I carried 2 rifles in the saddlebag, along with a box of cartridges and an oil tin. The dry wash beyond the trees made a clear stretch for practice. I handed her the lighter rifle. Want you sharp, I said. She ran her fingers over the barrel, checking the sights before raising it to her shoulder. Her stance was solid. She hit the first tin can clean off the post and the second just as quick. They didn't teach me to shoot for sport, she said, lowering the rifle. It was for survival. Raiders, soldiers, anyone who came too close to camp. I asked if she'd ever killed. She glanced at me once before answering. I was 15. He tried to drag me from a wagon near Mescalero. She said nothing more, and I didn't press. We practiced until the sun slipped behind the ridge, then sat in the shade sharing jerky and water. On the ride back, the light was turning gold over the hills. She asked if I'd thought twice about cutting her down that day. I thought about it every night after I said. So why come, she asked. Because I'd rather have you here than be afraid of needing someone again. She didn't reply, but the quiet between us felt settled. That night, we washed up by the well. She kept behind the rocks, but when she stepped out with her hair damp and a blanket loose over her shoulders, I stopped stacking wood without thinking. You stare a lot, she said. I try not to, I answered. Then why do it? I walked over, cupped her cheek. Because you're here. She leaned into my hand, eyes half closed. We didn't speak on the walk back to the cabin. Inside, the lantern burned low. She let the blanket fall unhurried, her skin marked by faint bruises and sun. I touched her gently, tracing the lines of old scars. When we came together, it was slow, her hands guiding mine, her breath warm against my neck. After she rested her head on my chest. "If they come again, what will you do?" she asked. "Stand in front of you," I said. "And if they bring guns, then I'll shoot first." Her voice was quiet. "I'm not leaving, even if it gets bad." I looked down at her. "I wouldn't let you." She pressed her palm against my heartbeat. "I used to think love was just a trick of loneliness," she said. "Now it feels like staying." The fire snapped softly in the hearth, the coyotes far off in the hills. The week that followed held a stillness that wasn't peace. No riders came, no messages, but I kept the rifle closer, rechecked the revolver by the bed, and added a second latch to the door. Naney moved with more care, glancing toward the trail before stepping outside. She no longer slept in the shed. Each night she curled beside me, her hold steady, not desperate. One evening on the porch, she asked if I'd ever thought about children. I told her I used to, but after the war, the want dulled. She studied me in the fading light. "Would you still want one with me?" My eyes stayed on the ridge. That thought doesn't scare me. She looked away, but I caught the small curve of her mouth before she rose. When she kissed me later, it was slower, almost deliberate. The way we lay together that night felt different, unhurried, as if there might be more days like it ahead. After she turned to me in the quiet, "If they come to take me, what happens after?" I had told her they wouldn't. She held my gaze. "You can't promise that." I nodded. "If they come, I won't stand down. If it means blood, it means blood." She asked if I thought they'd kill me for standing with her. "They can try," I said. Her voice didn't waver. "Then maybe I'll shoot first." The next morning, I saddled the mule and rode toward town without telling her. Keller and Thorne were on the steps of the hall, speaking low. They straightened when they saw me. "I'm not here for trouble," I said. "But I'll say this once. She's on my land under my name. That's all that matters." Keller's eyes narrowed. "You married her. Doesn't matter if I did or didn't. She's mine to protect." Thorne looked away. Keller's jaw worked. I stepped one step closer. "You ride out there again without cause, you'd better be ready." "I won't warn twice." I turned, mounted, and rode back the way I came. She met me at the gate when I returned. "You told them?" she asked. I did. She didn't ask more, just followed me inside. That night the shutters were closed, the door bolted, but the air in the cabin felt lighter than it had in days. We didn't speak of what might come next. We didn't need to. But when the first rifle shot cracked the air at dawn, splintering the barn wall, we both knew the quiet had ended. The first shot had split the morning stillness, the sound sharp against the barn wall where splinters still clung to the fresh break. I dropped the feed sack rifle already in hand and stayed low near the open stall. Hoofbeats faded down the ridge, not long after a rider, or maybe two, keeping their distance. When I stepped into the cabin, Naini had my second rifle laid on the table, her fingers moving quick and sure as she worked the rounds into place. "They didn't come close," I said. She didn't look up. "They will." We spent the morning making ready. I shored up the windows with scrap boards, cleared cover near the porch and barn, and set barrels where they could block a clean shot. She gathered what we might need: bandages, a water bucket by the door, food enough for 2 days if it came to staying put. There was no panic in her hands, only purpose, each movement measured. By mid-afternoon, I saw them through the haze, 3 riders at the southern edge of the field. Keller was in the lead, flanked by 2 men I knew by face, if not by name, ranch hands from outside town. Their eyes were hard before they ever dismounted. I stepped out onto the porch, rifle in plain sight. Naney stood behind me in the doorway, not hiding. Keller raised one hand. "Just here to talk," he called. That's what you said last time, I answered. He shifted in the saddle. Town's uneasy. You're sheltering someone who doesn't belong. I told you before, I said. She belongs here. Keller's voice dropped a notch. She's Apache Braddock. Every day she stays, you make it worse for yourself. I set the rifle stock against the porch post. Then leave. This ends one of two ways. It already ended. She's not going anywhere. One of the men to his left let his hand fall toward the butt of his pistol. I didn't blink. Try it, I said. I've got 6 shots, 3 each, if I split 'em even. Don't think I won't. The moment stretched long enough for the horses to grow restless. Keller spat into the dust. This ain't over, he said, pulling the reins. They turned without another word, the sound of hooves fading into the heat. Inside she sank into a chair, her breath steady, but her fingers restless against her knees. Next time they won't talk first. I nodded. They'll come with more. Her eyes found mine. Then let's be ready. That night we moved the bedroll to the far corner, set loaded rifles near each window, and kept the lamp low until we snuffed it out altogether. In the dark, her hand found mine beneath the blanket. We could leave, she whispered. Start fresh somewhere else. No, I said. This land's mine. You're mine. I'm not running from men who only own their hate. She was quiet a moment. You'd kill for me, I already would have. Her kiss in the dark was nothing soft, nothing shy. It was a promise. We didn't sleep much, the weight of what might come resting heavy between us. By morning, we were outside building a second wall of cover behind the cabin, digging shallow trenches near the field's edge and bracing the barn door with an extra beam. I showed her how to seat the shotgun against the sill for a steady shot. She didn't need the lesson. The sun had just begun to dip when the first plume of dust showed on the south trail. 5 riders this time, the scarf cloth high over their faces, rifles across their saddles. The light had gone red along the horizon, long shadows stretching toward us. I was at the porch, rifle ready, the stillness in my body, the kind that comes from knowing what's at stake. Across the room inside, she stood at the window. Shotgun braced her dark braid tied back tight. They stopped just short of the gate. Keller swung down and walked forward, his hands spread. You're making a mistake, Braddock, he called. Not too late to give her up. She's not going anywhere, I told him. Turn around now, and you leave with your legs. Stay, and you won't. This isn't about her anymore, Keller tried. It's about order. The town wants this done. My voice carried across the dry stretch. She was never yours to punish. One of the riders twitched and brought his rifle half up. My shot came fast, clipping the edge of his hat clean away. The horses shied, the men reined hard. I fought worse than you, I called. Buried them farther from home than this. Keller's mouth set in a hard line before he swung into the saddle. Let them rot on this land, he growled. They turned the dust, swallowing them, by the time the sun dropped behind the ridge. I kept my rifle up until the last shape was gone. When I stepped down into the yard, she came from the cabin, barefoot eyes still on the road. They'll come back? She asked. Maybe. She crossed to me, took my hand. Then we'll still be here. That night the fire burned steady. She stirred beans in the pot, her dress hemmed dark with dust, while I wiped down the rifle at the table. You thinking what I'm thinking? She asked over her shoulder. Probably, I said. I don't want to just survive anymore. I looked up at her. Then we build something. She smiled faintly. Small but sure. We already have. Later, as we lay together in the dim, I kissed her shoulder. I want to marry you, I said. She turned to face me. Is that what this is? It's what I want it to be. She studied me for a long moment. Then we're already married." Her hand rested over my heart, and the night passed without another word. A week later, we rode into Raven Hollow side by side, dismounted at the church, and signed our names in the preacher's book without asking permission. The townsfolk watched from doorways and windows, but said nothing. We rode home the same way we'd come, two riders on one trail. The land hadn't changed. Still dry, still quiet, still scarred. But in the cabin, something new had taken hold, strong enough to stand. And with spring came the first green shoots in the garden. She'd turned their leaves, catching the light like a promise neither of us meant to break. By early summer, the garden had begun to hold water in its furrows, and the first rows of green were steady enough to stand the wind. Most mornings, Naini worked there before the heat climbed too high, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled. I kept to the fence line, mending where the wire sagged and replacing rotted posts. There was a quiet rhythm to it, the kind that made the hours pass without counting. One morning I stopped at the garden's edge. "You think it'll hold through the dry months?" I asked. She stood brushing dirt from her hands. "If the roots set deep enough," she said. Her gaze was steady, but there was a weight behind it. "I've been thinking about what's next," she added. "What's that?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "If trouble comes again, I'm not waiting inside while you take the fire alone." Her words were matter of fact, not heated. I nodded toward the porch. "Then you'd best know every corner of this place." That afternoon, I showed her the lines of sight from each window, how to brace the rifle against the sill without showing too much of herself, and where the ground dipped enough near the shed to give cover if she had to move outside. She listened without interrupting, her eyes following each point I marked. When I handed her the rifle, her stance was already solid. As the days wore on, the air carried that stillness I'd felt before, too quiet, as if the land itself was waiting. We worked in the same slow, deliberate way, but neither of us had to say what we were expecting. By the third week of July, the sky hung pale and hard, the light sharp enough to make you squint even at noon. Late one afternoon, I was repairing the latch on the barn when she came from the cabin with 2 tin cups of water. She passed me one, her fingers lingering on the rim as I took it. "You think they're gathering men?" she asked. I drank, then said, "If they are, they'll wait for numbers." She nodded once her jaw set. We kept the rifles close from then on, one by the porch door, one in the cabin near the table, both loaded. The revolver stayed on my belt, even for small chores. In the evenings, we sat on the porch watching the south trail until the light failed. It was on one of those nights, the cicadas loud in the grass, that she spoke again. "When I first came here, I thought I'd be gone by the next sunrise," she said. I didn't look away from the trail. And now, she leaned back in her chair. "Now I've planted things." The next morning, we rose early. She set to the washboard while I rode the north boundary. No sign of riders, no tracks fresher than a day. I was halfway back when I spotted dust lifting faint from the south. It was far yet, but enough to quicken my pace home. By midday, the trail was empty again, the dust gone, but both of us knew it wasn't wind that had raised it. We went about the afternoon without speaking of it, but the air in the cabin felt closer, each sound outside drawing our eyes to the window. At dusk, we shared a plate of beans and bread, eating in the doorway with the last of the light spilling across the yard. She broke the bread in half, passed me the larger piece. "You'll be the one they aim for first," she said. I met her gaze. "That's why I need you steady." Night settled heavy. We checked the shutters twice, laid the rifles within arm's reach, and banked the fire low. She curled beside me under the blanket, her hand resting on my chest. "I'm not afraid of them," she said quietly. "Good," I answered. "Fear's a slow killer." The morning came with a sharp wind out of the west, carrying the scent of dust and something else, distant smoke. From the porch, I could see a thin gray line curling above the horizon to the south. She stepped beside me, eyes narrowed. "They're not far," she said. We made our final preparations before the sun was high. She filled the water buckets, tore strips from an old sheet for bandages, and laid them on the table. I checked the powder and shot, made certain every latch and hinge held. By noon, the heat pressed down like a hand on the land. She joined me on the porch, her hair tucked back, a quiet determination in her face. "When they come, don't tell me to stay inside," she said. "I won't," I replied. We sat there a long time side by side, watching the empty trail as if it might fill at any moment. It was near sundown when the first sound reached us, the low, steady rhythm of hooves more than a few carrying on the wind. She rose, lifting the shotgun from beside the door. I stepped down into the yard, the rifle snug in my grip. The dust showed before the riders did, rolling ahead of them like a warning. "They're here," I said. She came to stand just behind my left shoulder, close enough for me to feel her presence. The riders grew clear in the failing light, their silhouettes lined against the red sky. 5, maybe 6, moving as one. By the time they slowed near the gate, the air between us and them was tight with silence. I shifted my stance ready and heard her do the same. Whatever came next, we were already decided. They slowed as they neared the gate, 6 riders in a loose line, the dust of the south trail drifting past them in the evening light. Keller was at the front, the brim of his hat pulled low, eyes fixed on me. I stood just inside the yard, rifle steady against my shoulder. Naney was a half step behind me, the shotgun braced at her hip. They halted a dozen yards from the fence. Keller didn't dismount, only leaned forward in the saddle. "Braddock," he called last time to make this right. "Hand her over and you walk away." My voice stayed level. "There's nothing to hand over. She's not leaving." He gave a tight smile. "Then you've chosen your side." I shifted my weight, the stock firm in my grip. "I chose it the day you tied her to a pole." A murmur passed through the men behind him. One shifted the barrel of his rifle, catching the light. "Don't," I said, and the sound of that single word was enough to still his hands. Keller's gaze held mine for another breath before he sat back in the saddle. "We'll be back," he said. "Then we'll be ready," I answered. They turned as one, the beat of hooves fading into the hills. I kept my rifle in hand until the dust settled. Nayini lowered the shotgun, her jaw set. "They won't come with 6 next time," she said. "No," I agreed. "They'll come with more." That night we left the lamps dark and kept the rifles close. The wind pressed against the shutters, and somewhere far off, a coyote's call carried through the grass. We didn't speak, but each sound outside tightened the air between us. By morning, we'd set to work. I laid out a second layer of barricades inside the yard and marked firing lines from the porch to the far fence. Naney filled the water barrels and cut more cloth for bandages. She moved without pause, the sun high, before she took a drink. When the chores were done, we sat on the porch with tin cups of coffee, eyes on the trail. "If they bring more," she said, "we'll have to split them between us." I nodded. "You take the east side, I'll hold the gate." 3 days passed in that kind of readiness. The weather stayed hot, the land still, and the quiet wore at the hours. We rose with the sun, worked in the heat, and ended each day in the same 2 chairs, the same view of the south. It was near mid-afternoon on the 4th day, when I spotted the first trace of faint haze beyond the ridge. I stood without a word, leaning on the porch post to get a clearer line. The haze thickened, then broke into shapes. 7 riders this time. They came at a steady pace, not rushing, not slow. Naney stepped inside, returned with a shotgun and a box of shells. She laid them on the porch rail, then took her position at the east window. I stayed at the gate. When they reached shouting distance, Keller pulled his horse up short. "Last warning, Braddock," he called. My reply carried clear. "No warnings here. You cross that fence, you're fair game." The man to his right spat into the dust. "We could burn you out." "You could try," I said. My finger rested light on the trigger. For a moment, no one moved. The horses shifted tails, swatting at flies. Then Keller gave a sharp tug on his reins, turning away. "Next time you won't see us coming." They rode off, the sound of their departure long and fading. When the trail was empty, Naney came to the porch. "They're weighing it," she said. I nodded. "Which means they'll tip soon." She glanced at the barricades, then at me. "Then we make sure it tips our way." We spent the rest of the day tightening every weak spot. I showed her how to keep the powder dry even in a rush, how to reload behind cover, and where the blind spots lay if men tried to circle from the ridge. She took in every word, every mark I made in the dirt. That evening, we ate in silence, the sound of utensils, on tin the only noise. After she laid her hand on mine across the table. "If it comes to it," she said, "we don't stop until the last one turns back." I met her eyes. "We won't." We banked the fire low and checked the shutters twice. Outside, the land was still, but it felt like the stillness before a hard storm. It would break soon. The air was heavy that morning, the kind that seemed to press down on the skin. Even the wind had gone still. I checked the gate, made sure the hinges moved without noise, then walked the fence line. Naney was already at the east side, crouched low, tightening the last of the wire between posts. When she straightened, she glanced toward the ridge. "They'll come before sundown," she said. There was no question in her tone. I followed her gaze. A hawk circled far off, the only thing moving against the pale sky. By midday, the heat shimmered off the hard-packed ground. We kept to the shadows inside, both of us, near the windows, rifles within easy reach. The hours passed slow, marked only by the creak of the porch boards as one of us shifted position. It was near 3 when Naney caught sight of them first. "Riders," she said quietly. I joined her at the window. This time there was no dust haze, just shapes clear against the horizon, moving in a tight formation. There were more than before. I counted 12. Keller was still at the front, his horse a shade darker with sweat. They came down the slope without hurry, but with a purpose that set the back of my neck tight. When they reached the open stretch before the gate, they spread into a wide arc. Keller stayed centered. He didn't bother with a greeting. "We're done talking," he called. "Then you know where you stand," I said, my voice carrying in the still air. He nodded toward Naney. "You've got one last chance to give her up." I rested the barrel of my rifle on the fence rail. "You'll have to cross to try." For a moment, it was just the horses shifting, the leather creaking. Then Keller lifted his hand, and the men on the left started forward. I fired a warning shot into the dirt at their lead horse's hooves. The animal reared the rider, hauling hard on the reins. Naney's shotgun thundered from the east window, striking a fence post near another rider. The splinters flew, and he wheeled back. Keller pulled his horse around, shouting orders. They fanned wider, looking for a gap. We moved fast, me to the south fence, Naney to the east corner. Shots cracked from their side splinters and dust lifting around us. I dropped one man's hat clean off his head, close enough to make him curse and pull back. The fight stretched into long minutes, each side testing, never crossing fully. They circled, trying to draw us thin. We shifted with them, trading short bursts of fire. The heat and gunpowder made the air sharp in my lungs. When Keller saw they couldn't push through, he gave the order to fall back. One by one, they pulled away, gathering at the far edge of the open stretch. Keller sat there a moment longer, looking straight at me. Then he turned and led them out. The quiet afterward was almost as loud as the gunfire had been. I lowered my rifle and leaned against the fence post. Naney stepped out from the corner, sweat streaking the dust on her face. "They'll try again," she said. "Yes," I answered. "But they know now it'll cost them." We spent the rest of the day patching the fence where shots had hit, refilling powder horns, and stacking more wood near the porch for cover. As the sun dropped, the light turned red across the ridge. That night, we kept the lamps low. Every sound outside made us pause, listening for hooves. The sky was cloudless, the stars sharp and close. Somewhere in the dark, a lone horse gave a short, restless snort. I rested the rifle across my knees, my eyes fixed on the trail. Naney sat near the window, her shotgun in reach. We didn't speak much. There was nothing to say until the next move came. When it did, I knew it wouldn't be at the gate. The next morning broke clear, the ridge bathed in a pale gold light. The quiet felt different, less like the pause before a fight, more like the land itself had settled. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards cool beneath my boots. Naney joined me, her hair pulled back, eyes scanning the open stretch where Keller's men had stood the day before. The fence we'd mended still held each post standing straight. The only tracks left were fading in the dry soil. By mid-morning, Sheriff Alden rode in from town with 2 deputies. Word had reached him about the standoff. He listened while we told it plain, then nodded toward the trail. They're not coming back. Keller's been picked up for charges enough to keep him off the range a long time. Naney didn't speak at first, but I saw her shoulders ease. We walked the sheriff out, the sound of his horse fading into the distance. When the dust settled, it felt like the last loose thread had finally been tied. We spent the afternoon clearing the porch, stacking wood, and oiling the hinges on the gates. It wasn't about being ready for another fight. It was about keeping the place right the way a home should be. As the sun dropped, we sat out front, the light turning the fields to copper. A breeze moved through, carrying the scent of mesquite and the far-off sound of cattle lowing. Naney rested her hands in her lap. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," she said quietly. I looked toward the horizon. Out here, a person's luck can change fast, but if you hold your ground, sometimes it changes the right way. The first stars began to prick through the darkening sky. Lantern light from inside spilled across the porch, warm against the coming night. We didn't need many words. The land, the fence, and the steady quiet around us said enough. That's how life can be on the frontier. You stand against what's wrong. You take care of those who've been left with nothing. And you keep building something worth holding on to. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the peace you've earned. If you've ever known a day when the wind finally turned in your favor, I hope you'll share your story. Folks can learn a lot from the way you made it through.